So when I think about everything that we've listened to over the last day and a half, if I sat down and said, okay, what were the words that we perhaps heard more often than any other? It was the words resilient supply chain, with the notion of how are we going to get there being, again, driven by that notion of it will be led by the private sector, but enabled by the government. And so now I really want to have this conversation about how exactly is the government going about doing that enabling of this resilient supply chain. And it's really great to have Grant Harris here. Grant is again, the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Industry and Analysis, but he brings to this just a wealth of experience, having served in the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, and now in the Biden administration, but also with decades of private sector experience, including starting his own startup consultancy that worked a lot in emerging markets. So let me say, Grant, when you got to the Commerce Department 2.5 years ago, the whole structure and thinking about supply chain was still very much in its silos, where those of us sort of on the economic commerce side of things, we knew our lane was over here, and the national security and defense people were sort of on a different track, and industrial policy was a thing of the past. That's the Commerce Department that you walked into. And obviously now everything has changed when we see all of our economic security through that national security lens, where we have a very different approach to industrial policy. So what was your approach to turning the ship around? What were the kind of guiding principles for you in terms of how do we do that enabling of supply chains?
Great. Thank you. First, it's a thrill to be here with you. Thank you to Silverado as well for hosting this incredible event. I agree. The term supply chains has been mentioned quite a bit in the last few days. And I really like the way that you frame the question because it's been an evolution in the U.S. government's approach. And we are still facing a very tall order in making these supply chains more resilient. But I do think we have a lot to show for in recent years. When I first joined the Department of Commerce, Secretary Raimondo gave me a very specific charge. It was, how can we be more proactive and more strategic in our approach? Because my business unit in industry and analysis, we've got all of these industry experts. We cover everything from critical minerals to airplanes. We cover 90% of GDP. We've got economists, analytic capabilities, et cetera. And we were getting hundreds of taskings a year from the White House on supply chain related analysis. But as we were looking at what most of the topics were, a lot of them were more reactive in nature, something that we were facing a wolf at the door, something, whether it was infant formula not being on the shelves or some kind of disruption that was facing the American public at the time. And what we wanted to do was try to figure out how can we actually be more forward-looking. How can we try to be more preventive? How can we go deeper on those supply chains that are of greatest concern? And of course, this is a president who from day one has said that supply chain resilience is a priority. One of his early executive orders was to create sprints and to identify whether it was semiconductors or active pharmaceutical ingredients or electric vehicle batteries or any number of things, how the US government could do more. In my business unit in particular, what we started to think about was what is our comparative advantage? There's a lot of great activity. We had a very exciting speed dating round of US government officials the first night talking about what they're doing. And at a high level, it can sound very similar. There's a lot of big, broad phrasing. But what I think it's incumbent upon us and what we're really striving to do is ask ourselves, what is our unique value add? And our answer to that for my business unit is there isn't a broader set of industry experts anywhere else in the government. There isn't a broader set of economists and trade experience and international relations experience, but also the commercial understanding of these markets. You can't separate a supply chain from its industry. You can't talk big picture, all of the above kind of solutions about supply chains because they are so unique. You've got to understand the sector and what its needs are, what the market is, what the opportunities are. So we've been looking at that and creating a much deeper look with our supply chain center and with some other lines of effort that I'd love to talk about too.
So one of the innovations that has obviously been brought forward is this notion of conducting a risk assessment framework. I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about how does it work and what is it telling us about what the risks are in our supply chains?
Great. That's a really important piece. We're trying to answer some core questions, and one of them is, what should we be most focused on? There is a lot of anecdotal information in the supply chain space. There can be an echo chamber sometimes about where the risk is or what it means. So from our starting point, we've created this supply chain center as a hub and spoke. We worked on the concept over the course of a year with the White House to try to identify what was missing from the US government's approach. And what was missing and what we felt like we could uniquely add is creating an analytic engine with that industry and economic expertise. And identifying risk is one of those places. It's personally very important to me from past lives in trying to advise companies on risk, but I also saw when coming back into government that we didn't have a clear view of relative risk across supply chains. So we've been undertaking a very ambitious project in that regard to create an economy-wide risk tool that will help us understand sector by sector where the greatest risk is from a US government perspective. That means where the market might have issues that could affect US economic competitiveness and security, but also where there is national security risk, adversarial strategy, potential bottlenecks, and the like, so that we could be able to tell senior policymakers and the White House, this requires more attention. And ideally, getting that more to the product level to have very specific conversations with companies about what's flashing red for us, so that if they can price risk better and understand geopolitical risk as we're seeing it, then that could move the market in tremendous ways. That's one of the key pieces that we're looking at. We've also created other tools to help us with partners and allies identify in a data-driven way where our vulnerabilities are, direct or indirect, where theirs are. That's needed as a common operating picture and the like. And one final thing that we're doing to try to be more proactive is to create a very scalable model. What we're looking at is creating playbooks, things like on emerging technology supply chains, on how to do deep dives. We've got core industries as use cases. We're working very closely with industry, and we're trying to get a lot of feedback on these things too. What I didn't mention, but what is a little bit countercultural at points, but I think really helpful, on this risk tool idea, we're treating ourselves as a startup. It's not the easiest thing to do in an institution of 50,000 people that has its culture and ways over time, but we're iterating. It's ambitious, and so we're on version 4 right now, and we're meeting with people, we're crowdsourcing the solutions, the criteria that we're identifying. Extremely difficult in the paucity of data sectors and trying to get something that's apples to apples economy-wide, but it's what the US government should be doing to try to be able to see further down the road.
So I'm going to pivot a little bit to one of the subjects that's been the talk a lot of this, which has been the issue of critical minerals, with a lot of concerns obviously being expressed with how much of our critical supply chain flows to, through, et cetera, China. When you think back to Maureen's original presentation, you think of how often you saw that red flag bubble indicating China's complete dominance in so much of the critical mineral supply chain. So how are you using this new approach to supply chains? How is that playing out with respect to critical minerals?
Critical minerals has also come up quite a bit too, but that's fair since it's one of the themes of the conference. We've been using this in a way because clearly, it's a near-term and a medium-term and a long-term challenge for the US government where we need to do more. But it's also for us a use case on how we can be faster and better and more data-driven and look more at the commerce solutions that we might be able to bring. We've been taking a mineral-by-mineral approach. We've been thinking about what industry is doing in terms of gauging its risk on core minerals, but also how we can identify where is the highest value add. It's very easy in the critical mineral space to quickly say all of the above, everything, of course, onshoring, friendshoring, the market, et cetera. It's much harder when you're looking at a particular mineral to identify what will move the needle the most in the near term and the medium term. There are a lot of issues with pricing. We hear a lot from companies that it'll be very difficult to get the number of market entrants we need and the success at mining and processing, not just here, but in friendly countries as well, if there isn't more stability in pricing, if there isn't a clear sense of offtake. So we're, in our mineral by mineral learnings, able to use those as use cases for how we can map, how we can understand critical minerals quickly. We have a lot of interagency partners that are working on these pieces as well, so we are bringing to the table what the commerce industry experts can bring. And that is one defining feature too. One thing that I would say also to industry and the audience, we found, particularly on some of the lesser known minerals, there is vast unevenness in industry's appreciation for their dependence on them. And we do a lot of industry outreach each day, and it's concerning that there is a lack in some spaces of realizing that there can be a choke point here, or a bottleneck, or a dependency that can be very quickly escalated. You've seen gallium and germanium are subject to export controls, graphite. Some companies are quite aware of that. Others, I think, need to be more aware of their dependence so that they can make sure that they have as strong plans in place as possible.
So again, if I step back from it and think, okay, even if you and all of your interagency colleagues are wildly successful at figuring out resilient supply chains, at some level, the United States is not going to be able to make everything that it needs entirely domestic. So we are going to be reliant on global supply chains. So how are you looking at international partnerships as a way to, again, enable these secure, resilient supply chains?
It's a great question. You're right. We won't produce everything here. We need to have a coordinated strategy with partners, with allies. We need to be thinking strategically about how to do that. We've been asking ourselves at each point, what's missing from the conversation? As I was describing being proactive, being strategic, what does that mean and how do you actually do that? One of our answers is that we need to have a more data-driven approach to our friendshoring and our work with allies and partners as well. One tool that we've created is a supply chain exposure tool that leverages trade data and where our industry experts have put a qualitative overlay and made some proprietary calls on risk so that when we're sitting down with countries, say, in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, IPEF, we can be looking at shared data and identify where there's a vulnerability facing this country or this group of countries, where there's a vulnerability for us. And that could be dependence on a single source or a single country or any aspect of supply chain resilience. But it's meant to show us both directly and indirectly where those exposures can be. I've found in my past stints in government that that has been the thing that has most moved the needle in making a dialogue beyond the let's cooperate, we absolutely want to cooperate, we should work together, yes we should, let's meet in 3 months and talk again about how enthusiastic we are about cooperation, into more of the category of these are the things that we should do. You have to have shared facts to be able to do that. You have to have priorities. And then from there, you can identify parts of the supply chain. Because we, of course, are looking at the supply chain where we don't have comparative advantage. We're not going to be risking U.S. industry comparative advantage in the work that we do. And we're looking at where other countries are focused, and we need to identify that sweet spot, and we need to then actually work on transactions and movement and policy force so that things will happen, and it won't just be a great conversation about supply chains.
So let me just explore whether one of the places in which this might have happened is within that Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Because again, I think many of those many in the trade community were initially pretty dismissive of IPEF or just really didn't pay a lot of attention to it because it didn't sound like a traditional free trade agreement. There wasn't a lot of discussion about any additional market access into the U.S. market, so there was a bit of a kind of dismissal of it. And yet when we think about a lot of the countries that we've talked about over the last day and a half in terms of where are those critical minerals, where do those initial supply chains need to run, you know, many of them are these IPEF countries. I mean, it's Australia, it's India, it's Indonesia, it's the Philippines, it's many of those that are part of IPEF. So my sense is, you know, now that we've seen the actual, ink on the pages of the certain aspects of the IPEF, to me, where the workhorse of IPEF very well may be is in the supply chain pillar of IPEF. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about what is in that IPEF supply chain and how do you see it really in the immediate term having a real impact on this issue of creating more resilient supply chains?
You're right. The supply chain aspects of IPEF are incredibly exciting. IPEF covers a lot of important work, but the supply chain space, which I've been most focused on, this is a historic agreement with 13 international partners. It comprises 40% of global GDP, and there is a supply chain pillar that is creating a supply chain council across all of these countries. It's creating a crisis response network, and it's also creating a labor advisory group that has representation from industry, labor, and governments. This is a historic first of its kind agreement. Never before have countries come together saying, let's identify critical products, critical sectors, and create action plans around them where we can cooperate. And there's a lot of talk of friendshoring, as I mentioned, but to actually determine what that means to improve the resilience and safety and security of supply chains, particularly internationally and with partners, that requires a roll-up-your-sleeves framework to be able to do it, identification of what you're working on, and IPEF gives us that ability and that infrastructure to do it. I think there'll be a lot of activity in the coming months.
Fantastic. So one of the other themes that's really come out of this conference has been the emergence of the potential for new technologies. I mean, again, a lot of us even listened in last night to the very excellent discussion on the idea of lithium solar batteries that Keith Norman from Lighton was sort of describing. And we see this. I mean, the idea of green hydrogen and fusion and all other kinds of new technologies. So how are you ensuring that you're not creating these perfect supply chains for yesterday's technologies or the goods that we needed yesterday without really taking on board how are we planning for what is the needs, the future, the technologies that we're going to need 5 and 10 years from now?
It needs to be a great focus. We're creating, as I mentioned, in this scalable model of the supply chain, and I think the methodology and the playbook approach is a way to get at this. So let me explain what I mean. We're creating a playbook on emerging technology supply chains because, as you're implying, and I totally agree with, we can't wait to see where all the technologies go to then have a sit down and say, okay, that's where it went. How do we think about supply chains? That's absolutely not going to work. Hydrogen, you mentioned, is a perfect example. That's one of our use cases. The Department of Energy is deploying $10 billion approximately into hydrogen across the country. The technology can go in any number of ways, but we have a group, a tiger team, which is the language of love in US government. When you really care about something, you give it a fancy name like that. We have a group that includes the Department of Energy, but it includes our hydrogen experts, our economists, our supply chain services, our supply chain center, et cetera, working on how we get ahead from a supply chain perspective on hydrogen, where it might go, and what we need to do now. Same thing with quantum as well. Of course, we're very focused on critical technologies too, chips and many others, but I think we need to devise a playbook so that we know how to do this going forward, because we just haven't, as a US government, really taken that proactive posture.
So I'm going to pivot to one of the other kind of novel aspects of your job these days is to examine outbound investments. I mean, obviously for years and years, we've had the CFIUS process that has looked at inbound investments, but we really haven't spent a lot of time paying attention to what happens on the outbound end until now. And until the executive order, was released that basically says, no, we are going to start examining and putting disciplines on outbound investment. So that's your kind of area of expertise. Where is it now? Where do you see it going? How are you using a criteria to think about whether, when, and how we control what happens on the other side of the coin of foreign investment?
It's another great example about how this is not the Commerce Department as it existed 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So for outbound, for those of you who are maybe less familiar, last year President Biden signed an executive order that said that we're going to create a regime that will be able to stop U.S. capital that's flowing to startups and exercises that are creating dual-use technologies that threaten U.S. national security. And it defined quantum and AI and chips and said that there would be rulemaking around that to identify exactly what that meant. Treasury is leading this development, and then the executive order had also called out the Commerce Department in various important ways with respect to industry engagement, helping to scope what those sectors are, and the like. Again, it gets back to that backbone of industry expertise. The idea here is to have a very narrow, tailored approach so that we are not disrupting or having unintended economic consequences, but that we are preventing U.S. venture capital from going to, say, a Chinese startup that is creating AI that could have national security implications and will be used by the PLA to the detriment of the United States. Our approach in that has been to engage with a lot of industry throughout and hear how this should be done. I'm really proud of the work and the outreach that we've done. We've got a rulemaking process going on. There was an advance notice of proposed rulemaking that the Treasury Department put out. We're going through the results of that. We're preparing, Treasury again in the lead, a notice of proposed rulemaking. And this will be something that I think will fill a gap where we haven't had a tool to address that kind of risk.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask you one last question because I'm seeing on this clock that we only have 25 seconds left.
I'll make it quick.
So you've covered a lot of ground and you've had to move a lot of people in a lot of different ways to get this done. Of all the things, what's been really hard for you?
Wow. In 20 seconds to say what's been hard about all those things I've been saying. I've benefited from having amazing leadership at the Department of Commerce and a great team. It is a challenge to try to move a big institution to be as proactive and as nimble and as quick as we need to be in terms of encountering and addressing these kinds of things. But people have been embracing that. I'm most proud of how, I think for being proactive and strategic, we're bringing something unique to bear. I think it'll have lasting effects. It will need to be scaled. That's one challenge that we really face. We have a limited down payment of resources that we're thankful to Congress for, but we are sub-optimized in terms of the approach. There's a lot more to come. I hope everyone will keep an eye out for our supply chain summit this fall. It'll have a focus on data and analytics as well. And I hope that this will continue to be an important partnership with everyone in the audience and industry and labor and academia and all these others, because as we know, and from many other speakers who put it more eloquently than I can here, this is going to take these partnerships and creativity to really tackle these challenges. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, please join me in thanking Grant Harris. Thank you.